Hi, this video is Sharpening 101. I will explain you the basics so that you can tell the good advice from nonsense, and that's what we will focus on today. Let's get on. I will say it from the start right away. I will not be concentrating on sharpening techniques, nor show you how to get a super razor sharp edges or similar. My goal with this video is to explain the very basics so that you can tell good advice from bad advice and understand why for a given task, a given tool, knife or axe or other blade, a certain sharpening method is optimal, and why some improvisations sometimes work and what the downsides are. So let us start with that. This is like sharpening and blades zero, the preliminary. So when we look at blades, there are different blade shapes. We have flat blade, a curved blade, a serrated blade, and many other variants in between. So here I have some examples. This is a blade that is completely flat. So completely flat blade. Here is another example of a flat blade, and in this case it is a chisel, but the blade is still flat, and let's say that counts. Here we have a blade that has a slight curve. That's like a curved blade, and when you compare it to this blade, this one has a bit more of a curve, and there are thousands different variations of these concepts that I will not go into for the brevity of this video. And this is a serrated blade. There are also different kinds of serrations, but this first part is like curved, but this part is definitely serrated. So those are the basic concepts, that there are countless of different variations and combinations with separate names, and I may put those in the video's description, but that's the basic to understand. Now another important thing when we discuss blades are the blade profiles, and there is a reason why I'm starting with this, so bear with me. It will get more interesting. So we have first the chisel profile. That is an example here, which is a chisel in this case. So one side is flat completely and the other one has a certain angle. Angles are also important, we'll get to that. So we have that. Then we have a convex profile, which has its advantages or disadvantages, each of those. So here we have the sides of the blade coming together. All of these are symmetrical. This one is asymmetrical, and they come together and in a sort of a curve. And this is the concave, where the opposite curve happens, and these are side by side also for a reason. We'll get back to that later. We have also a Scandi grind. This is what it looks like. So it has flat sides and then it goes straight all the way to the edge. This is typical for axes and similar. This is for some special knives and when you want a very sharp edge, and this is for general woodworking and bushcraft, if you like. So this is what it looks like in real life. So we have completely flat sides and then just angle, and this goes all the way straight to the very cutting edge. So that is the Scandi grind. Another option, another typical blade is the flat blade, and they usually have, unlike Scandi grind, they have the very tip has a bit of a less sharp, of a blunter angle, if you like, at the very top, where the cutting edge is, and the rest is just the rest of the knife or the blade. So here is an example. Not the only, but one of the reasons why I got this knife was to show it in this video, because the collar here does the work for me. So we have flat sides with a certain angle, and then the very cutting edge is at a bit less sharp angle, a bit more obtuse, if that's the proper English term. So that is, the shiny part is called the primary bevel. I hope you can see it here. So we have the primary bevel and we have the rest of the blade, which is flat ground in this case all the way to back of the blade if my eyes are not deceiving, so or almost. And both the angle of this following section and the angle of the very cutting edge are important for cutting performance. So those are the types of shapes of blade. And when we discuss the properties of your cutting tool, knife, axe, whatever, angle is very important. So also is the entire width, the total width of the knife, and also tempering or hardening of the material, because still when you apply a certain types of procedure, the structure of the steel changes and it can get harder or softer. And each of those has pros and cons, so it's always a sort of a balance. And again, we'll get also back to that later. So here we'll briefly discuss the cutting. That's something that may not come very intuitively, but knife is basically, when you're cutting with a knife, it's basically getting wedged between the pieces you're trying to cut. It's moving them aside. The very tip of the knife, which we explained here, I will be jumping back and forth, so maybe it would be good for camera to be a bit, I should have brought these two pictures closer together. So the very cutting tip of the knife is what initiates the cut, but then the rest of the blade, in this case I drew a Scandi grind, but it could be any other kind, comes into play. And the wider it is, the more difficult it is to cut, because it needs to move more material aside. When we take a saw as a counter example, it uses a completely different system, because the small teeth of the saw are made to be a bit wider than the entire width of the saw on its back side, further away from the camera. And their goal is to move a bit of material out of the way and remove it so that this rest can follow easily. So the saw, as you are working it, is basically chipping away on both sides of the blade material, making the whole cut a bit wider than this back. You can measure that when you make a cut, and you need to take that into consideration when you're cutting things with saws and similar tools. So that's a completely different mechanism, but this is more primitive. We are just trying to wedge it in between, and that is why if we have a knife that is very wide, very thick in total, it will not be so good at slicing, but it will be stronger and tougher. And so for the thing that cuts, that is what many people don't understand. You can get the most super expensive blade materials. I think Magna Cut is nowadays all the rage. But the thing that does the cutting is the angle of your cutting and of your blade. Both are important. And the total width and the shape of the blade, depending on what you're cutting. And of course, if you don't do good hardening and tempering, or when you overheat the blade during some grinding or other ways of sharpening, if you destroy that temper, you will get a soft blade that's not working very well. When we talk about softness, the softer, the harder the blade is, the more brittle it is. And so that is also a trade-off, and the optimal balance depends on your intended use case. And so does this shape. For example, this is very good if you want to wedge between something, and it's great for axes. This is, I will show just a close-up, not very good example, not super sharp, but it's that kind of profile, mostly convex. So that's the profile that's great for that kind of works, while for some finer slicing and similar other profiles are more a better option, closer to optimal. When we discuss these two, you can see that here tip is very lonesome in a way. It hasn't got much support, while here the material is reinforcing it from both sides. I want to use this ruler and this, depending on the angle, if you make it more obtuse or sharper, you get more or less support for the blade itself. And I will use this as an example. So if we imagine this to be the very cutting tip of the knife's edge, so this part, the very cutting tip. So this is without support if it's very thin, and this is if we add some support, so get the bit more obtuse angle, so more material to support it, and so on, and vice versa. So while it is easier to initiate the cut and start going into material, if you have any, and it's not always, it's never perfect, so you will have some other forces aside and similar, you can more easily bend or break this kind of edge without much support. So those are some basic things, and generally the more obtuse angle, the more difficult cutting, the wider the blade, the more difficult cutting, but the more strength and less easy to damage it. And that leads us to the next section, the way that blades get dull. We have abrasion. That is basically just grinding slowly away the very tip, so it gets blunter and blunter until it is no longer sharp. So if we start with a sharp tip, then we blunt just a little bit, then we wear it a little bit more until it's basically no longer cutting and you need to sharpen it. So that's one way. Another way is misaligning and rolling the edge. I will use this to try to demonstrate that principle. So imagine this being the very edge of the knife. It's paper where I made it be a bit wider here, but so if you use a knife that's got very shallow edge, or you take one with a convex edge with great support, but you put it against something hard or use it very, very aggressively, then you might get part of the edge to make a bit of like this. And you might also make another part of the edge in some other, go a bit to the other side, and that rolling starts to happen. And when you take a wire and you bend it back and forth, it will break off. So this is the start, and if you don't get it straight, it will get more and more bent until it snaps off. And of course you can also have slight chips or breaks in your blade, profile from some other impacts and similar. So that all happens, and that's all, how do I say, normal. If you're more careful, you're less likely to use it, but sometimes you need to do hard work with some blades, and that's to be expected. So you can never stop it, just try to minimize it. And so we have the dents or chipping away of the blade, and bending and rolling, misaligning and similar. Now, a way to sharpen once we see that the cutting performance has decreased, or if we wish to stay on top of that, to keep our blades, maintaining them sharp, there are several methods to do. The first one is something that is very obvious, and that is to buy new. For example, when it comes to this I can buy a pack of 50 for a relatively small price, and when one side gets dull, I put the other one in, and when the other one gets dull, I just throw it away and get a new one. And for some work that I know that it's going to be rough on the blade and generally get it dull, but I don't have an alternative, this is the optimal choice. So the sharpening policy of buying a new one and having something like this in the workshop. Another option is to realign the blade, and that can be done by honing. So if you see tools like this is ceramic, and technically it can remove a small amount of material, but generally what it does, I will try to present it here. So when you take a knife and you are honing it, I won't be getting into details, but when you're doing that, you're basically using this tool this is like 1,000 times increased. So to get this tool, to get the blade, if it got some bends, bent back, so brought back to straight. It cannot fix any chips or similar, or if it got worn from abrasion, but the dents, the small dents, the fine dents, it can do. And for kitchen knives, this is a thing that works very well in my experience, to use before every use of the knife, to or better after when you wash it, to make sure that it's realigned, and that lets you not need to sharpen the knife very often, because if you leave this unattended, they will increase and then break off, and you have a lot faster knife dulling. So that's one option. Another option that you can see in Bosnia with people who use scythes to cut grass is that they carry a small portable anvil that's no bigger than this one. It can be stuck to the ground, and a small hammer, and they lay their saw's blade on that anvil and gently, with some skill, hit the blade so that if it got some big kinks, they iron them out to get them straight, and then use a bit of a sharpening stone to get it back to super sharp. So you can use hammer to get the material, hit it back into the shape, depending on the hardness and the type of tool. So the basic principle stays the same, that you're trying to get the blade back to its shape. And of course you can use abrasion, so different kinds of stones or even files for some tools like lawnmower blades or axes. You can even use a file, maybe a bit finer, but to get the thing abrasion and get it sharp. And what you do when you are using the abrasion is that you are trying, if we take this as an example of a knife, so I use the chisel profile because it's more obvious, easier to explain, but you can imagine symmetrical thing if you are taking any other blade profile as an example. So if we take the tool and we start using a sort of a abrasive tool to get this back, we need to remove, if we want to keep the same angle, so this is the late one that we have blunt, and if we want to keep the same angle, we need to remove this much material. Of course this is exaggerated, it's a small, but that's how much material we need to remove, and we need to keep it at the same angle. So that's the very important thing when you're sharpening. We'll get to that in a minute. But for a quick and dirty way to quickly sharpen the knife in the field, if you need to finish some cutting, whatever, you can do a bit of a cheating, and that is to increase the angle. So in this case you will be removing just this small section of material, not all this. So that's a matter of seconds. You will get a sharper blade, because the joining at the very tip will be again completely aligned, not curved, not anything, but you will have effectively increased the angle, and that will make your cutting worse. And once that gets duller, it will get duller relatively more quickly. It will be a bit stronger, but more resistant to chipping, or rolling, but get duller even quickly. And then if you need to resharpen it and you want to get back to the original shape, you are not left with many of these cheats. You can go with a bit steeper angle 2 or 3 times. After that, you need to do a proper job and remove enough material to get back the original blade angle. Does this make sense? I hope I've explained it clearly. If you have any questions, please use the BikeGremlin.net forum. And so let's move on. So we are looking at when we are sharpening with abrasion, the difference between again, for abrasion, you must be careful not, if you're using some grinding belts or similar, to not overheat it, because then you will lose the temper and get a soft blade that's useless. Now back to this, this is the perfect angle what we are trying to achieve. Again, using chisel as an example, and this is blunt. And so when we are sharpening, we are trying to keep the original angle, or if we want to consciously reprofile it to change the angle, then we're keeping that, whatever we have set upon, and we need to start grinding. I will show this just here as an example. So thing I forgot to mention is the blade thickness. I will just use this to compare these two. So we have this knife and we have this knife, and you can see when I lean them against the flat surface, so they are now laying flat, that the black blade is noticeably thicker. It should be very obvious here. Hopefully I'm not blocking the camera. So the black blade is noticeably thicker than silver blade, and so that affects the cutting performance. Also, this should give it more strength, all else being equal, but make it a bit less good at cutting, all else being equal. But they are not equal. They have also different profiles and other things, so it's a bit of a finer game, but the principles are those. So when we start sharpening, if we are sticking to our original angle, I will show it here. So here I have, this is very good for showing because it has a large flat side. I need to get this aligned properly and keep that angle all the time when I'm sharpening it. That is the tricky part. There are some, so you can with practice get your muscle memory to keep this. That's topic for a separate video, the sharpening techniques, but the idea is to keep the same angle while you are removing material, as I showed in those previous sketches, to not make things sharper, to not have blunter angle, or to not make it too sharp so that you lose support for your blade for the job you're doing. And the angles differ. I will put these side by side. So if we take a look at this chisel, this is the angle of that blade, and if we compare it with this knife, so you can see that they have different angles. Of course, this knife has the opposite side, so those would add up. It's not completely flat, but different tools have different angles. And for sharpening the flat grind, you are not interested in the main angle of this generally, unless you're reprofiling it, but you want to get the angle of the very cutting edge, and so this is a bit less obvious than it is with this kind of grind. So you need to find that position where the blade is, this cutting edge, where its angle has been achieved, and then use that for sharpening. So those are things to be careful about. And the main thing about sharpening with abrasive tools is to keep a constant angle and keep working until there is a sort of, it looks like a small wire on the edge of your blade, and if you're sharpening this side against the stone, then the opposite, the top side, you will be able to feel it with your finger, that there's something like a small thing that catches. Once you achieve that, you need to go to the other side and then repeat the process until you feel that thing on the opposite side. And once you've achieved that, you can use a way to remove that. If you don't, it will break off and maybe take some of the blade with you. So I'll show it here. So if you don't remove it carefully, it will make problems. You need to, when that starts thing, like some more material move the side, but not completely removed from the rest of the blade. So you need to basically do something like this. Once you have that thing, that when you go to one side and to the other side, and it's just flipping sides, then you've achieved it from both ends. Then you need to get something like a way we would do with paper when we use our hands, and then try to get a clean rip of the paper without using scissors or anything. So we want a clean rip. We don't want to see this. And the way to get a clean rip is usually by using leather strops. So the procedure for using leather strops is to start with the back of the blade going forward, get your right angle of your blade, and then just gently follow it and remove that burr. You can also put some grinding paste on that to make the blade finer. That is closer to the super mirror sharp edge. We'll get to that in a second. But that's important when you are sharpening with abrasive things, and in general to use proper method to remove that burr or wire. Otherwise you will have ruined your job, and you will have to in a way start over again. Not right from the start, but start over again. Now when it comes to the very finish of the cutting blade, if you go with different roughness of stones and sharpening things, they are usually done marked in grit. So from 100 or 2 very coarse to a few thousandths very fine. And when you start doing scratches with some coarse materials, they will leave noticeable marks and leave the marks on the side of the blade where you are sharpening, and also the whole edge profile will be left a bit toothy. And then when you go with this finer gradient, you should do it in steps. You first remove a lot of material if you need to, if there is some greater kink, and then use a bit finer and go finer and finer to the way that you get as smooth as you like. Now, the smoothness and the coarseness are not a problem in and of themselves. Sometimes you want a coarser cutting edge. For example, if you're cutting tomatoes or similar, very smoothly, super sharp edge will not bite into that skin as easily as a bit less sharp knife with a bit of teeth. And that leads us to back to the cutting side of things, so cutting angles. If we want to cut a material that is not completely uniform, cutting angles are very important. Not just the angle of the blade, but also the angle that we do the cutting. For example, if I wanted to cut this cardboard and I try to do it like this, I would not get very good results with this blade, because my blade is uniform and it's trying to push along these fibers of this. But if I turn it to the side and then start cutting, I will cut it very easily. So that is one thing to pay attention to. If you buy a good quality bread knife, it will be serrated. And that is not because serrated knives can be sharper or because tips have some special properties. That is a common misconception. The main thing about serrated knives is that they change the angle. Let me draw some serrations. So if we have a serrated knife like this, or even blunter serrations like these, and you have some material that this is going into, you can see that they have angle that is like this and like this and like this. They have all the angles touching the material in one stroke. And so for bread that has different structure inside, how the materials and the grains align, it's a lot easier to do a nice cut of bread with that. And also for some other things like plastic insulation and similar stuff, sometimes it's more practical to have a serrated blade to start doing that. For example, with a serrated blade, if this one had serrations all the way from the head, from the start, not just here, I would probably be able more easily to cut this on its side. This way I cannot really engage this because it's too thick, but the principle is that those angles at which you're entering the cutting make a difference, especially when materials are not uniform. Of course, that's when it matters most, like cutting wood. If you cut it across the grain or perpendicular to it, it makes different behavior completely. So those are other important things. And to sort of round this up, the basic principle is to figure out what kind of tool you have and what kind of cutting you're doing. And that affects your sharpening angle and perhaps even changing the profile of your blade, as I did here. This was Scandi grind, but I changed this profile to be very close to the convex grind. So that has some pros and has some cons, but it goes like butter through reinforced cooler hoses, for example. So everything has it, and you can play with it to a certain degree with a given knife and given material, and hardness of different materials, their rust resistance, abrasion resistance, toughness, how easy they chip, those affect what you would be wise to do with them in these terms if you want them to stay sharp for longer. But the thing that does the cutting is your profile and thickness, width, and everything, and even the cutting angle at which you are approaching. So those things are important. But again, when we're talking about sharpening itself, pick the grind you want, pick the optimal angle for your cutting, a compromise of strength versus sharpness, basically, and keep at it until you find and reach the burr. and then go with finer stones to the level of fineness that is optimal for your use case, and then use a proper thing. I use and recommend strops for removing that burr in a way that does not destroy the knife's edge sharpness, doesn't break it off aggressively. So that's the whole point. And different sharpening methods, movements, and tools and everything, they are just to help you get this done. And depending on your situation, market availability, what you're using the tools for, different tools may be the different optimal choice. Your optimal choice will differ. There is no best, there's only optimal for you. If I'm going somewhere on a long hike, I will not be carrying this to get my knife sharper, for example. Also, know when to stop. There is no shame in having your knife be as good as you need it to be. If you like and enjoy it, by all means, and for practice and to see what it's like, go for the mirror polish and for everything. But once you went the full circle, I think at least that's my opinion. I haven't got other people's opinion to give you. So the thing is that you should stop when it's good enough. For example, and this is a very good example, this X is going to be doing some work that's not really ideal for an X, but it will be because of circumstances. So I have no idea, no plan of getting this super sharp for the imminent future. Once it's done its fair share of beating, then if it survives, it makes sense to give it a proper edge, and you have different axes for nice working with wood and for chopping and for other stuff, so, or demolition. So depending on that, you will know when to stop, when it makes sense. Similar goes for many knives, depending on your use of the knife and what you're using it for. So you may want to get it super sharp or get it just reasonably sharp and so on. And that's it for this video. I hope it was educational and helpful. The target audience for this video is anyone who's interested in understanding the very basic principles. And I'm also very much looking forward to hear your thoughts, experience, and comments on the BikeGremlin.net forum. I will, if I don't forget, log the comment section of my videos, because YouTube is crazy with comments and the knowledge gets lost. So that's the whole video. I want to thank you very much if you sat through all this. I also want to thank the generous Patreon supporters who have enabled me to and helped me a lot to keep working and sharing what I know. And that's it. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. If I do, I'll put it in the video's description. Cheers, stay cool.